Welcome, everyone. My name is Kerry, Ressler. We're delighted. Hope you're enjoying the World Medical Innovation Forum so far today. We're delighted to talk with you about the panel entitled The Mental Health Clinical Trials, Measurable versus Hype. And we'll be diving deeply into a whole range of components of mental health clinical trials. Of course, happy to talk about many of the issues that we currently face in mental health, from placebo effects to biotypes, biomarkers. But what we're really going to focus on today is really the excitement of digital approaches in digital mental health, with, again, the idea of measurable versus hype. So what we thought we would do is start with introductions, and then we sort of have a whole series of questions and discussions that I'll lead off with our panelists, but really encourage you all to raise your hand or stand up or jump in at any point. This is really meant to be an informal discussion with everybody, and I'm sure many of you are experts as well in this space and would love to kind of brainstorm together with you about both how exciting it is, but also at times how daunting. So in terms of introductions, and we have a mic if you need it, but if you just yell out, we can also repeat the question. So my name is Kerry Ressler. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer at McLean Hospital. My primary research area for about 20 years has been at the basic science level, understanding of emotion regulation and amygdala function in mammals, and then at the clinical translation level, understanding how we can prevent and understand and treat post-traumatic stress in large-scale studies such as genomics and lately digital phenotyping. Nationally, I am the president of the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology and a past president of the Society for Biological Psychiatry, and I'm a member of the National Academy of Medicine. And at McLean, in addition to my scientific roles, have worked very closely with Laura Germine, Justin Yip, and Justin Baker, and Ipsit Bahia, related to the technology and psychiatry program at McLean as we really wade into the waters of digital phenotyping and biology. So I'll let each of you introduce yourselves to get us started. Maybe Laura?
Hi, my name is Laura Germine. So I wear a few hats. So one is working with Dr. Ressler at McLean Hospital, where I co-direct the Institute for Technology and Psychiatry. But maybe more relevant to today, I also started a digital research platform around cognitive assessment back in 2005. It was one of the first ones on the web. I have a laboratory for cognitive health technology that develops technology and validates it. And I also run an external small technology company that does dissemination of digital technology in, mostly clinical research sorts of studies. And so I think for this today, I'm going to mostly wear that latter hat as sort of a person who develops technology, tries to get it out there, tries to disseminate, tries to make it work, and tries to get it funded, which I think are some of the challenges that we face in this sort of sphere.
And I'll brag a little bit more about Test My Brain, which is Laura's spinoff not-for-profit company, which is really one of the world leaders in scalability of digital phenotyping. I think you have over 3 million people worldwide that have taken part. And so really, when we talk about normalizing psychiatric data, nobody has the kinds of numbers that Dr. Germain's team has. So really great expertise there. Thank you.
Good morning, Phil Wong. I'm a psychiatrist and epidemiologist. I used to be on the faculty at the Brigham and have rejoined it to start a new center for learning health systems, and maybe if we have time I can explain what that is. I'm a professor of the practice of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, also a professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I also previously was the deputy director of the National Institute of Mental Health, and I had the privilege of learning probably everything I need, or everything I know about digital mental health from my boss, Tom Insel. He's just so prescient and so far ahead. In some ways, it's occasionally helpful to be a little bit slower than him because you can sort of see the challenges that he encountered, and I think maybe we'll discuss some of what, in particular, some of his companies, startups have encountered.
Wonderful, yeah. So Phil really represents, as formally many of our boss in terms of NIH extramural funding, as well as really seeing the industry-academic connection, and then Laura, really the academic, the government and regulatory and funders and academic connection, and Laura, the industry-academic connection. So just a few words to start off in our first question. So again, as we said in our summary, it's really time to rethink the approach to clinical trials in mental health and develop new models for prioritizing measurable outcomes. Again, broadly, there are many areas for improvement, as we know, in mental health clinical trials, from strong placebo response, the need to focus on biological subtypes and biological targets, and the need for predictive and treatment responsive biomarkers. And while we're happy to discuss any of those, We really want to focus today on the very exciting yet daunting roles of digital behavioral and mental health. In particular, two recent companies, Pear Therapeutics, which recently filed for bankruptcy and had people were very excited about their app and their approaches to value-based mental health. They were first of its kind with Oklahoma with a value-based mental health program for substance abuse and opiate use disorders for digital-based treatment paradigms. But things went south quickly, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why that may have happened, whether it was moving too quickly, not understanding the payer structure, not having enough outcome data. And then MindStrong, and so Tom Enzel is one of the co-founders of MindStrong, as the former NIMH director and one of the world's experts in digital mental health. It had all the reasons to think this was going to be a remarkable success. They were really trying to create, as I think was said by Paul Dagum, the smoke alarm for using digital biomarkers to predict both risk for psychiatric disorders as well as potential treatment outcomes, as well as have treatments. And yet, while it's still in business, it's significantly downsized and reduced its initial visions and goals. These were both companies that were extremely highly anticipated and had set out to transform scalability and efficiency of mental health biomarkers and treatment approaches, but were met with many possible unexpected hurdles. So we'll maybe start this big picture, from a perspective in terms of why are we here and definitions. And so, Phil, if we can start with you and some of your first thoughts about this conundrum that we have.
Yeah, thanks, Kerry. And I think you've already touched on part of the issue is when we say digital mental health innovations, that covers a broad waterfront of potential, not just use cases, but therefore different types of studies and validation processes, right? And they're not all the same. I think just to get us a taxonomy, certainly for this discussion, but maybe sort of also to begin unpacking these different use cases. One is, as Kerry mentioned, what are called digital biomarkers, in particular, predictive biomarkers. What these are, if you think back to sort of traditional biomarkers, these are measures of either a disease mechanism, or if they're a predictive biomarker, what they're supposed to do is allow you a measure, a tool that allows you to predict someone's clinical course or their treatment response, right? So that let's call those digital biomarkers. I think the next is another term you probably have heard or use. It's called like digital phenotyping or a digital outcome measure. And what this is a tool of, think of it as sort of a measure of a clinical endpoint that you might use in, say, a traditional randomized controlled clinical trial, right? This is the clinical endpoint that you want to move, right? And then a third are, and Laura, obviously you will help us understand what these are. It's a whole bucket that we call digital therapeutics, right? And so this could be anything from computerized cognitive remediation, or it could be a way of digitally delivering a more traditional treatment. And there's also delivery of preventive interventions, right? So let's call that a digital therapeutic preventive intervention bucket. The final is one that sort of crosses all of the above. I'll call it digital disease management tools, right? And these are tools that allow clinicians maybe to digitally screen for a condition, monitor how well a patient is doing over time. It may actually provide what is called clinical decision support. So these are actual recommendations to a clinician around what you should do based on these longitudinal measurements. It's also a way to do care coordination across different members of a team, right? And so there's a lot of startups that are in this digital disease management space, which again is kind of an amalgam of many of the facets there. But maybe I'll turn it to you since you actually live and breathe this, Laura.
Yeah, so I'm curious, how many folks here are clinicians?
Just a few.
Okay. How many folks here are investigators, research investigators of some kind, research scientists?
A few.
All right, how many folks are on the, I'm going to be an academic right now, the industry side? Okay. Pharma? Digital technology companies of some sort.
Okay, great.
Okay, all right, good to know. So I think that, to Phil's point, the fact that there are these very different ways of thinking of digital technology and mental health and different kinds of digital technology and things that the digital technologies might be doing. I think one of the big challenges is knowing the regulatory landscape and this evidentiary standard that you need for each of these different sorts of technologies, right? So to show that a digital therapeutic changes a health outcome is very different than to measure a health outcome in a sensitive and specific way, which is different than measuring change over time that might be related to changes in symptoms, which is perhaps different than a tool for disease self-management versus a tool for clinician management of a disease with a patient versus a tool for educating a patient in a psychoeducation context versus a tool for sensitively measuring something where we don't even know what it is. People talk about the glucose of mental health, right? Like, how do you make mental health like diabetes? I mean, you don't, because it's not, right? There is no glucose. Like, we're measuring feelings and thoughts and dysfunction in systems that we don't have any ability to directly observe. So the idea that we're going to find a glucose, I think, is probably the one that investors are the most excited about, but the one that I would say, I mean, maybe I'm being pessimistic, but is least feasible. So, you know, my journey in this, and this might be familiar to those of you in the digital technology world, was starting from a place of actually extreme arrogance about this. I remember when I first started building digital cognitive assessments, I thought, these neuropsychologists, some of my best friends are neuropsychologists, so please excuse me saying this is just a narrative story, are so stuck in the mud doing the same thing that we've been doing for 100 years, right? So an example was the trail making test. I don't know if folks here know about the trail making test. It's a connect the dots for neuropsychological function. And I thought, how do we still use this stupid test? And so we started building digital assessments and saying, like, okay, this is new. It's doing something these other assessments haven't done before. Here you go, clinicians. And the clinicians were like, well, this is not actually that useful because I don't know what any of this means. You're like, well, what, you know what a connect the dots means? Like, what? But the problem is that these are people coming with 10, 20, 30, 40 years of experience seeing what happens when a patient does well on that test, what it looks like when a patient does badly, what that correlates with. And this is pattern recognition, right? So we're asking people to throw out pattern recognition that they've built up across their careers and adopt a tool that, honestly, our validation evidence is mostly based on we did this one thing and it looked really awesome, and also, isn't it cool? Like, that's not good enough when it comes to actual healthcare. It's great potentially for some investors who don't understand healthcare that well. And I think, you know, my journey with the trail making test has gone from let's reject it entirely to let's just make a version of it because everyone wants it anyway, and let's just like make it like sexier or something, right? We're gonna like measure new things off the trail making test. To finally sort of accepting the fact that a lot of what digital health does well is make things that weren't accessible before accessible, make things that perhaps were hard to do a little bit easier to do. And the idea that we're going to throw out all of the pattern recognition of an entire field built off of decades of using traditional tools in favor of something that, you know, 1 or 2 years of validation data, maybe in the best case, I think is unrealistic. And so how do we deal with that tension? And what do we do to bridge the gap between all of the experience that clinicians and researchers have built up over decades and these new tools that might be doing things in a better way, but often that's, you know, sort of unknown. And I think this is across the board. It's for biomarkers, it's for digital phenotyping, it's for digital therapeutics, but it's not the case that it's just innovation, and if we innovate enough, it's going to overcome these barriers. These barriers are systemic, they're regulatory, they're in basic human experience of clinicians. We're not going to be able to get past that, and we don't want to, I think, is the other point. So.
Terrific clarifications, both of you, thank you. So Laura, just to come back to that, and with maybe one first rebuttal, I wonder if maybe I'm sure I'm more optimistic maybe than you are in this space, but glucose is in many ways the disorder itself, the level of glucose in cell regulation. So I wonder if we have more optimism for things like hemoglobin A1C, a second order marker that is not the brain, but might be peripheral biomarkers or might be behavioral biomarkers or might be, you know, other sorts of indirect measures. You bring up one of the things that Laura has said before is validation versus revolution, and the idea, you know, where's there discovery and so exciting on the investigator side, but then it has to be proven, it has to be shown to be predictable, it has to be reliable. So how do we appreciate the different drivers in this process of excitement? Laura's idea of revolution of investors versus validation for FDA and the payers. Can you comment on your thoughts on how the field can walk this tightrope so that we can both take advantage at the right time of the most excitement, but not do it too fast?
Right, so I think, you know, both these terms, revolution or innovation and validation, can mean different things, right? So the revolution can be two things. It can be convincing investors this is a revolution, right? Which hopefully has some relationship with reality, but that's one thing. And the other thing is changing health outcomes at a scale that we're dealing with major problems of mental health equity or issues in serious or severe mental illness, right? We're changing outcomes for people at hopefully a global level in a way that really changes things, right? Changes the landscape. I would hope those two things go together, that the technologies that investors are really excited about and the technologies that stand to really change things in more than an incremental fashion would be the same, but maybe not. And I think we recognize that sales and what is reality are not always the same thing. On the validation side, it's really, this becomes, I think, to me, validation used to mean show that it works, where that really was kind of undefined, right? Like works means lots and lots of things. But really, validation means understanding the evidentiary standard that you need to have the payer or the consumer or the customer or the client or the partner buy, right? Use your technology, implement it across the system. And so understanding in a specific space what that evidentiary standard might be. And I think sometimes I've thought it was more than it is, right? Like I remember thinking you have to demonstrate that, so if it was a biomarker type thing, that changes in the biomarker result in large, significant changes in the underlying, clinical symptoms or something. Often the first level of validation is showing that in a patient population that has these clinical symptoms, you can feasibly and scalably address, do the assessment in the first place, that it bears some relation to symptoms, and that that relationship is not confounded by something really significant like socioeconomic status or something else that's, not really what's of interest, right? So you don't need to show everything at once, but being able to tick the basic boxes of it can be used in a clinical environment. If it's something that needs to be implemented in a clinical environment, it's feasible. So understanding what the validation is, obviously as soon as you get into clinical trials, that's a whole different landscape, right? So understanding the basics of what the FDA wants to see. I remember the first time we dove into 21 CFR Part 11, doing data collection, so electronic data collection that can be integrated into clinical trials, right? So it can be used as an evidence, data as evidence in a clinical trial. It was probably the most horrific experience of my life. And I'm not exaggerating, right? Having been through cesarean, major medical events, right? Like just all of childcare all the way through. No. 21 CFR Part 11 audit was the most painful experience of my life. And it was going in and not realizing, and I think it was so horrible. I remember at one point talking to an auditor, my eyes were glazing over, and I was drafting a policy over on my other monitor because they were asking about it. Like, I've fugued on so much of this because it was so traumatic. But they were asking about a policy that I'd never heard of. I had one of my folks over here Googling what the policy is, slacking me instructions for the policy. I'm writing the policy on my right monitor while the auditor is looking me dead in the, thank God, the zoom eye, because otherwise I wouldn't have been able to pull this off. And I'm slowly dragging a Google Doc into the center of the screen and going, yes, this is the policy document you're looking for? And I remember the person just looked at me and just blinked slowly and was like, why don't we talk about this tomorrow? And it was really, really painful, right? These are very, very painful regulatory and compliance structures, right? You have to understand them in order to not get past them, in order to satisfy them. And so being clear, are you in a digital therapeutics? Are you biomarker? Are you doing tracking? Which of these things, are you in clinical trials? Which of these things are you having to satisfy? So.
Thoughts on that, industry?
Well, just to follow up on what Laura said, the rest industry has a very clear understanding of, how you validate a biomarker or, show that a therapeutic is efficacious and safe. And for some reason, it's gotten these processes for validation have gotten suspended, or maybe it's because digital mental health innovations seem to shift or cut across these different types. And so what we would instinctively say, like validating a treatment target, right? For those of you who deal with biological treatment targets, all right, yeah, you need a probe, you need something that engages the receptor, and you have to show that engagement leads to some clinical change that manifests from the engagement of the target. I mean, for some reason we've suspended that knowledge, right? And those ground rules. Regulators haven't, but we have. And so I think for each of the categories in that taxonomy, like digital biomarker, okay, you have to validate that engaging it, with a probe leads to some change in a clinical outcome of interest. validating a predictive biomarker, all right? You have to show that you can predict treatment response or clinical course or some adverse outcome or something like that. The therapeutics, very straightforward. They're phase 1, 2, 3, drug trials, and you just have to, you have to conduct them and hit the mark. And same thing, digital disease management, well, disease management, programs or tools, have to be tested in an effectiveness trial, right? And it has to lead to better clinical outcomes. So for some reason, that has gotten suspended when we talk about digital mental health innovations, but regulators and payers have not suspended their demand for that evidence.
Seems like everybody's still searching for the roadmap for how do you do this in the digital space.
And I think we did have some missteps early on, and that's part of the reason for the confusion, right? Like, for a long time, and I'm going to speak to software because that's what I know, software was treated like devices and drugs, right? By large institutions, by regulators, like as if a piece of software can function by the same rules, both from an IP level, from how do you commercialize, thinking about how do you go to market as these other things that we knew really, really well, which is devices and drugs. But it's ultimately like just really, really different. And I think one of the big differences is that software changes and evolves. Think about learning healthcare system. The sorts of things that it could produce or the sorts of engagement with the user, all those things could change from one version to the next. And those versions have to constantly change, right? You can't have a piece of software built in 2001 work in 2023. The world in which it operates changes, but software is constantly developing new problems and new bugs because things like devices change, browsers change, people change in the way they interact with them. And so how do you accommodate this constant, essentially continuous need for validation, right? You can't say it's validated, done. It's validated and now it's not because you changed some aspect of the user interface in order to make it more accessible and now all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore, right? Like, do you have to then submit your paperwork all again and go through that entire, clinical, evaluation for efficacy and effectiveness and all that again because you changed a color from light blue to dark blue and changed a font? Well, no. I hope not. But I've been in situations where we've worked with a user design team, and my developers hate user design people, which is horrible because these are both really important folks that need to be able to work together, right? But there's the user interface design that changes something that seems really not a big deal. It just makes it a little bit more friendly. And now all of a sudden, human behavior and how they interact with the tool changes. And we're measuring human behavior. We're measuring cognitive information processing, right? Now it's different. Now all of a sudden, people under the age of 18 aren't doing it anymore. People over the age of 65, suddenly their scores tank. All because of a user interface design decision that was meant to make it more accessible. So that doesn't happen with devices. That doesn't happen with drugs. God, imagine if chemistry changed every year or two, right? Like, oh, this chemical reaction doesn't work anymore. Like, that's not a thing. And so I think it's really, really challenging, and technology developers, I know I struggle with this, right? The idea that this is, even that paper that was published that was, gold standard validation a few years ago, our software's not the same as it was a few years ago. And there's no way not to have your software change, so.
Well, on that note, in terms of thinking about the challenge, we're just going to keep talking until we see hands raised. Thinking about the challenges of both replicability, but also, what does the FDA want? What do payers want? What's the right market plan? I think the post-mortem is still being done on Mindstrong and Pear, but one could argue that Mindstrong maybe moved too fast before they had enough trials or had enough data. Pear, on the other hand, had FDA approval. And yet then they, part of the issue seems to be not being able to figure out the right market plan, the right payer plan. So let's say I have a great app. It's beautiful. Some smart people have looked at it. Great focus groups. We're ready to go. Is that enough? Or what do I need as a startup that has a great app to be aware of to really make this work? Thoughts?
Yeah, I think, just as there is sort of evidence that one needs to generate for each of these particular use cases of a digital health innovation. Obviously, regulators have their own, requirements for approval, and so do payers, and they're different. And for those of you who are in companies, you're going to have to navigate both these, and there's no assurance. FDA approval does not mean if you get FDA approval as software as a medical device, there's no guarantee that insurers, which use different evidentiary information are going to reimburse for it. So efficacy and safety, yes, very useful. You need a trial, but you also need to do what's called cost utility analyses. Right now, these are for payers, and that involves collecting information on the cost and the cost that you need to pay to achieve a certain level of utility, a quality-adjusted life here, right? And payers have fixed budgets, and they will only pay for interventions according to a league table, and your cost-effectiveness, ratio will determine how much, where they stop and say, oh, we're not going to buy, right? And so, but those are the rules, and again, it's a different type of evidentiary base that you're going to have to produce in order to get through each of these hurdles. Ultimately, payers reimbursing for your digital intervention.
Oh, we have a question. Go ahead.
Listening to this conversation, I'm wondering if there isn't a disconnect for mental health products that you don't necessarily...
You do have a mic.
So listening to this conversation, I'm wondering if there isn't a disconnect for that's perhaps momentarily specific to behavioral health products that isn't quite seen as often in biologically based, and I don't mean to put that in a different, because all is biologically based, but for companion diagnostics, for new therapeutics, there's a fairly clear path forward for this works, and here's what we will accept in terms of safety and efficacy. And I think I'm wondering about the evidence level on safety is pretty clear. What are people doing as a result of this interaction with this device? For a lot of software, you'd have to have a pretty extreme case where it would be something severe happening that would be a safety risk for using the software. But is the efficacy piece not as well established in the FDA's mind? And then that's translated, yes, it's a clear device, but does it really work? Because I think the two examples you're talking about, one, there was a clear device, but the insurance industry went, meh. And how does it do? Because it's, Lori, I think you're absolutely right in terms of the comments you made earlier about it's been long established in the clinical laboratory business. You can have a fabulous brand new test. It's better, faster, cheaper, and no one cares because you're not getting reimbursed as much as you were with the old technology. And is that environment way ahead of where the mental health environment is today, and what types of data is needed to bring that to a point where you can be relatively sure that if you do have that stamp of approval, that somebody's going to look at that and say, yeah, no, I'll pay for that.
Yeah, terrific. So already, one of the things we're planning to talk about, I think is perfect for this, is what makes good data in the digital mental health space? What are the outcomes we need to be making as standard? How do you approach this problem?
Right, I don't know. That's really hard. And your question, Glenn, of all the complexity in it, I'm just going to say, I don't know, but. I remember a mentor once told me that no one wants to know how the plane works, right? Which I think when you're early on with a new technology, you want to tell everyone how the plane works, right? You're like, oh, it's awesome. We have this thing, and it does a new thing that you haven't seen before, and it has all these fancy bells and whistles and stuff. And end of the day, the person who you're partnering with, selling to, whatever, the payer, wants to know how will this reduce my costs or increase my revenue, right? All the fancy stuff in between is just evidence that it will reduce costs or increase, income, revenue, whatever. And end of the day, I think that we want to be able to tell a story about global accessibility. We want that to be true. And I wish that all of that information about benefits to public health and benefits to patients and benefits to research and the progress of science were enough, but it's not. It has to, whatever the technology is, has to reduce costs. And I'm not in a world where I need to have insurance pay, thank God. like, you know, my company is bootstrapped. It was very much like you need to find people who will buy the thing in order to pay the people that will make the next thing and so on, right? And so that's a harder problem, but also a much simpler problem because you don't need to scale at the same pace that you do when you have investments. But end of the day, I remember saying, you know, the technology company I run is a nonprofit company. We do open source and open science. Like, we are dedicated to full transparency. And I would tell people that. I'd be like, yeah, you know what? Like, when you partner with us and you're paying this amount, that is for open. They're like, yeah, open science is great. Like, am I paying for that? Am I paying an extra 20% for your open science? And I remember being really shocked by that because I thought that that value of openness and transparency was one that people would be willing to partner for, right? And I remember talking about, and I stopped doing this, that like, you know, your partnership with us on this project will subsidize future work for people who are in communities that don't have resources, right? So we give grants to, you know, folks working with indigenous communities, for example. Good people didn't want to hear that, right? They were like, I don't have enough funds right now to pay my staff, right? I'm going to have to lay someone off. And now I'm paying extra so that you can fund some pet project somewhere that I don't know anything about. Like, and I think that was hard for me to really, and I still haven't internalized it, right? I'm still going around talking about the do-goodery story. When at the end of the day, the person I'm talking to really wants to know, how will this reduce costs? And that's the big, big, big thing, right? And I think this is the evidence that the payers need. The evidence needs to be, will this reduce costs? By how much? Over what time period? And I think the problem that we're dancing around here is that it probably won't in the short term. Right?
Well, thought threefold, because I mean, I think this is really more the broad mental health problem, right? I mean, most other areas of medicine, it's very concrete outcomes. It's death and cancer, right? It's heart attack. Yes, we have suicide, and unfortunately, they're frequent. Fortunately, they're not frequent enough for our metrics. And so much of the rest then is quality of life, or it's days out of hospital, or it's work years. But those are very hard to do, except in value-based systems, and we've, as a community or a country, haven't quite figured out how to use that approach yet.
Yeah, I think, you know, you both are hitting on, you know, when you say what's the right data, I think we would at least arrive at a consensus that we don't have it, whatever it is. I think, you know, certainly, you know, data from small, expensive, you know, randomized controlled clinical trials that don't involve real-world patients and comorbidities and don't measure, you know, the outcomes that you both are talking about, quality of life. They don't look at time horizons that matter to a payer. In other words, they want to know, am I going to keep you out of the hospital for, you know, some measurable period of time, such that if I pay for this digital, you know, therapeutic, it's worth it to me, right? So, you know, that is problem that's more global than just mental health. You know, there's kind of a dissatisfaction, I think, across healthcare that these rarefied, small, expensive clinical trials just aren't cutting it. And so, you know, I think you all know, you know, part of the 21st Century Cures Act was, you know, kind of there's an impetus to develop what's called real world data, and use it to generate what's called a real-world evidence. And so there's an increasing push to use, by real-world data, these are the nearly ubiquitous administrative claims data that, you know, there are hundreds of millions of person-covered lives that, you know, insurers have, for example, and the nearly ubiquitous, you know, electronic health records, right? It is very challenging to work with these data in terms of things like measuring clinical outcomes. They don't have, you know, the standardized, validated measures. So it involves a kind of statistical gymnastics, if you will, which is sort of nascent. It involves advanced causal inference method, you know, the sort of stuff that you basically need a PhD in informatics to wrap your head around it. But ultimately, the impetus is to use you know, these very large data sources to generate the real world data, real world evidence that hopefully is more satisfying to all the stakeholders who want to know, do these work, right? I mean, are they worth are they worth their cost, right? Which is ultimately the everyone's on everyone's mind.
Okay. Great. Let's see. Let's start with you in the back first, and I think you're first. Thank you. Thanks. Great points.
Yeah, I just mentioned two things. We've talked about payers a lot. I used to work in an insurance at Aetna, and I did just want to mention that insurance companies have a very different set of metrics than employers. Employers are actually where the innovation happens in the employed population space. Their timeline is 7 years versus 3.5, and they're just more incented to innovate. So that's kind of a really interesting, if you're starting a company, that's where you're going to see people taking some risk and doing some innovation. The second thing I just wanted to mention is one of the places where this has worked is, and honestly, it's because, and I was hoping you were going to come up with A1C here in the discussion today, but one of the things that people have done is aligned their outcomes with another outcome. So, one successful digital health company, said, we can't really measure, the measurements aren't great in the depression space, although you can certainly measure it, but you can definitely measure diabetes, and diabetics with depression have, 3x the cost of, diabetics without depression. Right. So by aligning their metrics and attaching accountability to the diabetes metric, they were able to get employers to pay really quite a lot for a digital plus, behavioral health strategy. That was very effective. So sometimes we have to kind of do that in this space, is find the other aligned metric and attach ourselves to that.
Yeah.
Great comments.
That's a great point. When you said 3.5 years, insurance company, as in cost, like
Employed populations, if you have an employed book of business as an insurer,
yeah.
you may only keep that employee for 3.5 years.
Yeah.
Right.
Medicare business that, you're going to be 7+, but an employer is typically going to have a longer timeline.
Yeah.
7, 9 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, 3.5 years. Whew.
Just to follow up on, this is a very insightful comment. You have to look at the perspective. It's not just what's the cost utility of this thing. It's from whose perspective. Right. And when I used to be at the Brigham, before going to NIMH, we conducted a large effectiveness trial of, in this case, telephonic disease management for depression, but we worked within Fortune 500 companies. So GM and American Airlines, and but we were very interested in measuring not just does your depression symptoms, do they resolve or get better, but we added a measure of work productivity. And we conducted our cost utility analysis from the perspective of the employer insurer. Because, at the end of the day, what are they trying to do? They're trying to keep their workers productive, right? So I think, you're putting your finger on not just an opportunity, but also, and not just the type of data, but from whose perspective are you conducting these cost utility and cost benefit analyses?
Terrific.
If I could just add in one comment on that, because I spent a fair amount of my time in a previous life in a clinical laboratory trying to convince companies like Aetna and others to pay for molecular genetics. And this goes back 15 years now, but the comment I was getting often in talking about why they should pay for that is it's important and these are the diseases. And they said, well, yeah, but we only have people in our plan for 3 years, and these are downstream. And the way I got around it finally was none of us are getting out of this alive. You can't insure the healthy people. So you need to pay attention to this, because the people that come into your plan are going to be just as liable for this sort of thing as the people that are exiting your plan. And I don't think we're there yet for mental health.
Right. The gentleman in front, did you? Yeah. Go ahead.
My name is Eric Noël from Diamantis in Canada. I'd like to thank Mass General for the invitation. Thank you very much for having me. Our company has invented a way to scan someone's eye to discover biomarkers for schizophrenia, bipolarity, and major depression. And our next steps are in autism and other disease, where basically we are flashing the eye in a certain way to find low latency electric signals that give us somewhere around a 90% accuracy rate in terms of what it is. And we want a FDA scientific breakthrough. So for me, contrary to Laura, FDA has been great supporter. They've been very friendly. When you invent something very bold, they want to regulate you, even though at the beginning they'll say they won't regulate you, but the further they look at your invention, they will. My question to you, because you have a lot of expertise, for us in the go-to-market, we could bring the technology to market with a pharmaceutical company that is interested in mental health, or we go with a maker of the ERG machine, the ophthalmology manufacturers, or we decide to go for a diagnostic company. But again, in those three, what we're facing is the fact that the mental health is not necessarily truly something that they want to address first, or because they have not manufactured something that will be on the diagnostic side, it's difficult. So anyway, in my go-to-market, I wonder if you have tips for me in terms of who would be the best partners to roll out a psychiatric diagnostic instrument in the US.
Great question. I think just to restate the obvious, Aaron, do you still have a question as well next? Okay, we'll come to you next. I think most know that big pharma and industry we're getting more invested in then the 2008 stock market crash, and at that point, everybody sort of slowed down. That was about the same time that oncology was making a lot of the new precision medicine breakthroughs, cardiovascular and others, and they just were very hesitant to come back in. And you hear different stories from different people. I think part of industry says, well, you haven't proven to us yet that your pipelines are predictable enough or proven enough that we know what to do with it. So I think there's a bit of a fear of it. But there's no question this is a huge multi-billion-dollar industry that is untapped, and there's only a handful of new psychiatric mechanisms of action that have been FDA approved in the last decade or so. So it really feels like the time is right in terms of the progress in neuroscience and genomics, but waiting for the right folks to come along. But I don't know if you have specific recommendations about.
I did have one very, very specific thought, and that was if I was evaluating this technology and you were not partnered with a company doing the hardware side, so there's something, you have an algorithm that you're applying and you have no control over how the data is gathered to apply that algorithm or to do that detection, I would be very concerned that divergence between the hardware and the software would render your technology,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it has been standardized with 1,200 participants. So now every time that a technician will scan the eye, it will be the very same way. The only thing is that ERG equipment makers are small companies. They are not a GE or
Right. I mean, still though, as someone who works with hardware where I've heard a lot that the variation doesn't matter, I know that it does in my world, right? Like, I work with mobile technology, right? And it's not the software, it's the hardware. It's how expensive was that phone to make. It determines how quickly, when you touch the screen, it registers a touch, which determines the measurement of reaction time, which determines everything that follows. So I think just from a risk mitigation standpoint, something that says that is not a risk. The fact that you're intimately connected with the hardware in some fashion, that would be my concern, but that's super, super niche, and I'm sure that there's bigger considerations in that. But anyway, just for my input coming from the vision science world.
I think from the regulatory side, obviously, it's a very dynamic time, for on the FDA side. I mean, there's changes, in terms of the, having served on the both drug advisory committees as well as devices advisory committees for the FDA. They have different rules between them, and they are changing rapidly. Again, as the FDA gets a handle on things like what we were just talking about, like what is a digital endpoint, what is a digital biomarker. In other words, they're getting their, they're unpacking all this sort of in real time and trying to come up with a regulatory framework for this. So my only advice would be, obviously, get in touch with them. It sounds like you already are. And, because they're going to tell you, look, what are the studies we're going to require, and what are the endpoints you're going to have to measure? And you know what I mean? In other words, you want to negotiate that, obviously, with them and get their most up-to-date guidance.
Yeah.
And they are, by the way, I'm Canadian. I cannot do my technology in Canada, but with the FDA, I'm meeting people who
Yeah, that's great.
In my own country, confidence yesterday, I was with the Minister of Health of Canada, and he didn't care at all.
Yeah.
And I'm coming here, and it's fantastic. Your scientific community and even your regulator popped up. I want to congratulate you because I wish my country had your model.
Well, and I think the other broader issue about biomarkers, whether it be predictive biomarkers, treatment biomarkers, target biomarkers, is, for example, if this has a high specificity or sensitivity for schizophrenia or autism, I think the first question is going to be, well, that's great, but it only takes about 2 minutes for a clinician to understand psychosis and schizophrenia. So what is it going to add value to? Is it going to target specific biological subgroups that are going to be better responsive to one drug or another, or when you have diagnostic dilemmas where you'd have two different divergences? So I think really having that narrative is going to certainly be important that we have to tell to our ministers of defense, et cetera, or health. Thank you.
Right.
Erin.
Thanks. Certainly the regulatory process and gaining a clearance that, we feel is supportive of something meaningful is important, but to Stan's point, if people aren't going to pay for it, it's not going anywhere. And this has been, I think, a challenge that I've spent most of my career in med tech. And as soon as reimbursement became as critical to gaining acceptance over other forms of how devices were chosen, it's, working out these, economics of the procedures became like the first thing that you really have to start thinking through, as opposed to, we'll get the regulatory clearance and then we'll sell it and then we'll figure it out, But that said, just seeing some of the recent failures that you described, what I'm curious about is, are you seeing more collaborative efforts, conversations going on either between, insurers or patient care groups, that are of note that you're aware of that are focused on trying to crack this in any way? And are there any highlights that you can maybe share from this group about how those conversations may or may not be moving the needle?
Great question. Thoughts?
This is having. I'm now, I think I'm older than I look, and I'm now starting to suffer the ravages of aging and can use some of these cognitive, disease-modifying antibodies that are getting approved. But I think I don't think it's hype. We suddenly have disease-modifying treatments for very devastating, very prevalent, very costly conditions. Alzheimer's-related dementia. That is, I don't know about the others, in the audience, but it's injecting a kind of optimism, right? And so I think people who might have just written off kind of
the 15 years of, okay, we're going to wait for CNS's time to come. Yep. Maybe they're coming back.
Exactly. And I lamented, and Tom, was leading the charge on this, that, we were lamenting that, there had been exodus, of pharma in particular, from the CNS treatment development space, back really when the first, antibodies failed, right? These very large trials that failed. So I think my hope is that if we can sort through the hype from the rigor, the rigorous evidence that would be necessary, you might see a reentry of, in particular, big industry, funders, which need to build out this pipeline, right? And so, anyway, I guess I'm the half full kind of, person, but I'm hopeful.
Yeah.
And I think, this session started off of the, fall of Mind Strong Health and now paratherapeutics. But I think it's unreasonable to expect every company that's even, let's say that they were doing everything right. Doing everything right doesn't mean you succeed, right? I wish it did, but
most things fail in the business.
Most things fail, right?
Like the things in psychiatry somehow don't get as much buffer to say,
right. And I remember reading this thing about the beginning of, the automobile industry and how many companies were making automobiles in the early days because everyone sort of knew that there's something here. This automobile is like a thing. It's going to be big. Why did the Ford Motor Company come to dominate? Is it because they did everything better or right and everyone else did everything wrong? I mean, there's a process of just, at the beginning of anything new, everyone's excited, there's going to be lots of failures. That doesn't mean, though, that the entire area is doomed to fail, right? And I think we're in a similar place now with digital technology in health, digital mental health, where we know there's something really important that we can do. We have some inkling what it might be, how to do it, what the payers are, but there's a lot of luck involved, and it doesn't mean that just because some companies failed that they were doing something even wrong. I don't know that they were doing anything wrong. Maybe they were, I don't know. It's just how it goes, right? So I share your optimism, I think, in general. Yeah. I wouldn't want to invest necessarily in any one player.
I mean, more specifically to the question, though, in terms of insurance or employers, I think everybody's aware of the mental health crisis. We knew there would be a post-COVID mental health crisis, and it's here, and we don't have enough beds anywhere, and people are waiting in waiting rooms. So in some ways, it feels like the payers and insurance are so focused on the current crisis that it's a little hard to say, what do we need to do so that we're not in this place 3 to 5 years from now? And again, it's Canada and Europe thinking about socialized medicine or large companies. It almost feels like that's going to be the group that can really do proper value-based approaches are going to be the ones to solve it. But I don't know of models in which it's quite there yet. And I think we were hoping for paratherapeutics in Oklahoma and this partnership, and that would be an example that others could build on. But for a number of reasons, it didn't quite work out.
Yeah.
Great. I really appreciate the engaging discussion so far. I just wanted to go back to the earlier kind of topic of validation. And I was just wondering what your opinions were on about that, and if whether part of this maybe challenge of validation may kind of have to do with benchmarking against kind of rating scales that themselves have been widely acknowledged to have a lot of limitations, and that could potentially be responsible for this kind of problem.
Yeah, I personally wonder, and it was you sort of triggered my unease about treating DSM-5 diagnoses and scales that measure them as valid clinical endpoints. Right? I think we all know, these. I don't think we could have designed a more heterogeneous and simultaneously overlapping, nosology than we have. Right? I mean, you have 1 of 2 cardinal symptoms for depression, 5 of 9. It doesn't matter which ones. For secondary symptoms, and you could have
most. There's tens of thousands of ways to get to depression or PTSD.
You've heard that what people have are personal forms of depression, right? So if you're trying to find a treatment for depression, well, good luck, right? I mean, and so this is part of also. Again, I just need to give credit where credit is due. When Tom and I were sort of thinking, what on earth are we going to do here, right? This is a mess. This is an absolute mess. To look for the biological basis of depression is a mess, right? I mean, and if you're investing, millions, billions, it's really humbling, right? And it's really daunting. So I think part of the problem is coming up with an ontology, a nosology, that actually is based in biology, ideally, neurocognition. I mean, that's our best guess. What are the fundamental units of psychopathology? What are the fundamental systems in the brain that can go awry, right? And they're not DSM diagnoses. They're probably more like, I don't know if any of you have heard of, this RDoC research domain criteria, but it's an attempt to sort of bridge these heterogeneous overlapping DSM disorders, which are fundamentally hard to measure, very hard to understand, what the biological bases are, and therefore find treatment targets for, into something that's a little bit more tractable. Maybe units of neurocognition, units of neural systems that we do know something about, right? And you know more about this than I do, but that's, I think, also something that gives me kind of grounds for hope in a way that.
Yeah, a couple of metaphors. When I'm talking to med students or psychiatry or residents, half the genes in the genome are specific to the brain, and yet, and the most common effects of brain dysfunction is mental health behavioral disorders. Yet we have 5 sets of disorders that we tweak, but right, depression, substance abuse, psychosis, et cetera. There's got to be 50, if not 100 different subtypes of depression, and yet we're using the same. Yes, we tweak what our self-reports are, but they're basically the same tools we've had for 200 years. How are you feeling? Tell me some questions, and then we cluster those together. So, in many ways, it's kind of like you've got the stethoscope in the 1800s, and you can say where the cough is, and you can tell a story about the cough, and you might say it's black bile, and then you can give codeine, and you've treated the cough, right? And in many ways, our monoaminergic treatments are sort of the codeine for the brain. We're suppressing the symptoms, but we're not getting at the 100 different types of biological subtypes that are lung cancer versus pneumonia versus viral pneumonia, et cetera, et cetera. And as long as we keep saying cough is the final outcome, we're not going to get to that underlying biology. We've got to figure out how to subtype the biological parts, and that's where RDoc, from a research perspective, has been really helpful. But FDA, people keep struggling with it because we have biomarkers, but FDA is not particularly excited about biomarkers. Whether that's true or we've just not figured out the right way to validate the biomarkers so that FDA is ready for them, but it's a little bit circular because industry is not excited about putting their money into a biomarker-based assessment if they feel like FDA is not going to then support it on the other end.
I think the point you had made about tying it to another disease in which you can measure things a lot better is a good one with respect to this, right? Like, what are the objective clinical metrics that you can link to that are perhaps don't have the same problems as something like just PHQ or something. And I think this is where partnering with healthcare organizations and clinics and places where patients are seen and where these objective clinical outcomes can be measured is really important, right? Like, I'm the master of do a survey on the internet in a bazillion people, right? But end of the day, you miss a lot of those objective clinical metrics that you really need to partner with healthcare systems and healthcare organizations to get. And so I think that's a really important one too.
Hi. Thank you. This has been really fascinating. I'm here actually through the I-Corps NSF, which is really focused on figuring out how to get from academic research into industry. And so I was wondering, I think through this process of discovery for me, it's these small digital health companies say, okay, well, it's hard to get to clinicians, right, and patients, so let's pivot to industry and clinical trials endpoints, and maybe that's a path. And then you figure out there that, oh, actually, this will help us maybe get to FDA regulation because they have the money to fund this. And then they come back and say, oh, actually, you need to do that before you get to us. And I'm wondering if you have kind of input and advice in that realm and how to which benefits can you try to glean from a partnership like that to kind of, maximize that benefit and partnership? And what could the realistic expectations be?
I think one thing we spoke about in planning for this is the cost of pivoting is really, really high in digital health technology, right? Like, it's not, I think the software model is fast fail and you pivot rapidly, you find the market, you iterate, you try things, blah, blah, blah. Like, that is really much harder to do in healthcare because once you've committed to a certain path, you've put a lot of resource in it. You can't just change to something totally different. Or I suppose you can, but it's very, very costly to do so. So, it's hard when you have, I think this is where when software and healthcare come together, it's really tough, right? You have two very different cultures. You have two very different ideas about how you go to market, how you, scale, how you find a market. I don't know of any really good examples for an organization that's done that well and figured out how to merge those two cultures. I'd be really interested to hear if anyone in the audience knows of any really good examples, but I think that's exactly the tension that you're talking about. How do you do the slow, careful, incremental work that you need to do to get to the healthcare market and to do things right in healthcare with all the flexibility and sort of energy of the software.
Large-scale clinical trials is almost the opposite of nimble innovation.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's tough. So no good answers except to say the problem is, I think, ubiquitous.
I think, probably Glenn, more about this than I do, but I think large academic health care systems in particular are interested in providing, I think, platforms for that can kind of bridge this space where, let's say, you do have an innovation. Could you very rapidly conduct a stratified trial among people who are likely to have the deficit that your therapeutic is improving or something like that? To do that in isolation, is nearly impossible for a small company, right? I mean, to develop a clinical trials infrastructure, and so you're left, needing to work with a CRO, and I won't get into what some of the limitations of that are, but I think another I think grounds hope, if you will, is the fact that there's an understanding that these large academic medical centers are treating an awful lot of real-world patients. They are capturing data, labs, imaging, in their electronic health records. There's also a lot of free text that if you can do natural language processing on, you can get very rich clinical information from. And so, those could then be used to generate hypotheses. In other words, you could look for causal relationships between, say, whatever you're interested in. But you also could, identify very fast, quickly, expanded and diverse sampling frames for trials, right? And that's another innovation that could really help with, digital mental health digital mental health innovators. But it takes, as you know, I think that's one of the bases, I think, probably of this conference, is to sort of show how large, particularly if large academic medical centers form networks. Right now you've got a real-world data, real-world evidence platform that could host, support, lower the costs, the activation energy for a whole lot of innovation. So another potential grounds for hopefulness.
Yeah, terrific. And we're almost out of time, but last question.
Hi, thank you. I had a question regarding pattern recognition. I thought of, you said it earlier, we're all here walking around with our smartphones in our pockets, and you have the ability to collect a lot of data. I mean, depending on tone of voice, you could see when you're using it, sleeping patterns and so on. So just curious, what do you think it should be easier to make clinical trials if you could have that tool, easily collect the data, but what are the limitations, and why haven't we really seen that type of validation being kind of accepted by the regulatory agencies?
In many ways, that's what MindStrong was supposed to do, use the phone, use the tool. So maybe brief answers, and then we can wrap up.
Just briefly, I think this is one of the areas where there is something there. There is signal there that's going to be useful. It's separating it from the stuff that looks exciting, looks useful, but is not, because it's, things that are related to the hardware or things related to, socioeconomic status creeps into everything, right? Like, what are the things that you think you're measuring important clinical metrics from, but you're actually not? It takes time to do this sort of science that gets you to where you can separate the wheat from the chaff, but I do think that there's a lot of cause for optimism in those spaces.
Final word from you, Phil?
Yeah, I agree. Again, digital biomarkers, vocal biomarkers, facial emotion recognition software, they're really quite useful, and if they can pluck out, sort of more biologically based, tractable, units of psychopathology, disease mechanisms, I think we're in good shape. I think, the MindStrong example that's one where they kind of changed use cases sort of along the way, and well, anyway, that you know more about what the dangers of that are, I think, than I do. But if you lose your business model and you're trying a new business model, well, that's going to be pretty hard for the evidence to show that your tool is useful and worth paying for.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is it's relatively easy, a low bar, to say this person's ill of some variety or not. But at the next level of specificity or precision, or how is this different based on one biological or another, the field is just very, very new. So I think we both have these amazing tools, still trying to figure out what to do with them, and it's going to be, it's going to be more than a few years to figure this out. But I think, exciting stuff is coming. So thanks, everyone. Mm-hmm.